Thank you so much for joining us for this Tuxedo Park Library event, and thank you to our participants. We have a very nice crowd, especially for a Monday evening that's a school night.
Yeah.
So welcome to you all, and thank you for what I think is really going to be a wonderful, spirited, informative, and important conversation about voting, which I'll let you see my shirt. And Erin wore hers, and Diane from the library is wearing hers too. Which
excellent. We're all coordinated.
In spirit, we're all aligned. So the way that we're gonna structure this loosely is I'm gonna introduce Erin in a minute, and we're going to jump into a conversation about both the books, but in the beginning, we're gonna focus on a couple points of interest that I think are interesting for all generations, but Erin and I have designed to be especially interesting, we hope, for our younger readers who may have joined us tonight. And given both of our awareness of the attention span of younger people, to say nothing of their parents, we thought it would be good to start with that, and then we're gonna discuss some of the current issues with vote by mail, COVID, the Electoral College, etc.
All the simple things.
Simple things. To start, I'm really excited to introduce my very close friend and colleague, Erin Geiger Smith, who is a journalist who has written not one, but two books. Thank You for Voting, The Maddening, Enlightening, Inspiring Truth About Voting in America. And she also wrote a middle reader version that is really delightful. And if you have any young person you might want to get the book for, it just has all these little places you can dip in and read in snack sizes, and it's really a delightful companion to this book, which is also very readable and filled with contemporary information. So Erin, as I said, is a journalist. She's a lawyer. She's from Texas. She graduated from law school at the University of Texas and then moved to New York and went to Columbia School of Journalism for a master's. She has written for the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. She covered legal affairs for Reuters and has moved on to really focusing on voting at a moment that we knew would be important and timely, but really, I don't think anybody could have predicted all this. So,
no,
and we will, at the end, maybe in, 40 minutes or so, we'll open up the floor to questions. So if you want to, I think if you can see, there's a little Q&A button. You can put questions in there. You can put them in the chat. I will look in both places, and we'll be sure to give everyone a chance to ask Erin the questions that they want to ask her. So without further ado, we thought we would start discussing where certain terms come from that are really connected to voting that I really wasn't aware of the etymology or where they came from. And Erin has just done so much research and dove deeply into the history of voting to that point. So first, ballot. Erin, tell us where the term ballot comes from, please.
Ballot comes from the word balota and little ball, and it's because people used to vote by voice or vote by, putting a little ball or a pebble or whatever in a canister. I did look really hard to see if cast your ballot came from, the challenge of throwing the little ball from afar, but unfortunately, I did not discover that that's where cast came from, cast your ballot, as much as I really wanted to. But the ballot is from little ball, and it has just lasted through when we had, paper ballots.
What language is that? Italian?
They used Italian, but they voted that way at times in ancient Greece too. But somewhere along the Italian time, ancient Rome period is when that word developed.
Well, I think cast your ballot. I mean, I buy it. I know that, as journalists, we like to have a little bit more confirmation.
Right. I really did look. I was determined that must be what it was. So somewhere, maybe I'll discover that soon.
Okay, keep us posted.
All right, I'm not resting on it.
Tell us where the term party ticket comes from. So for any junior voters here with us tonight, your party ticket, the Democrats, their party ticket is Biden and Harris, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And for presidential elections, we vote for the president and vice president as a group, and it's called being on the ticket together. And President Trump and Vice President Mike Pence are on the party ticket together. So where does that term come from?
So as the term developed over time, people also use it to say, I'm going to vote the party ticket. So in some states, you can choose to just at the top say, I'm going to vote all Republican. You hit that button and it does it all the way down. And so that's voting the party ticket. And that came from when we first had written paper ballots. People had to bring their own. So the government didn't provide them. You had to bring your own paper, bring your own something to show who you're going to vote for. And parties, to make it more convenient for people, would hand out pre-filled out ballots. So, you know, the party hands it over. And so it looked like a train ticket. And so the two just kind of came together. It's party ticket, and it's lasted a really long time.
Wow. Yeah, that has. All right, so, you know, let's move on to, and please define these terms also for those of us at all levels who are unsure, but I'm curious, and you write about this a bit, the difference between a suffragist and a suffragette, and explain the difference between those two words and where they came about.
Sure. So they both mean the same thing, which is women who fought for the right to vote, but suffragette is really only properly used for British women who fought for the right to vote. It was something that was used to describe them initially in newspapers as a negative term. So et, you know, the suffix et being like, yeah, diminutive. And but eventually the suffragists there in Britain adopted it and kind of took it over and owned it. But American women really never took to it the same way. And so that's why you'll see historians in America talking about those women as suffragists and not really referring to them as suffragettes. So it was kind of just the British women took it on, and the American women just didn't want to use it in the same way.
There's a play that was supposed to open on Broadway this fall from one of my very, very favorite playwrights and composer, Shana Taub, that's called Suffragist. Mm-hmm. And the first song, I believe, because I went to a public theater Zoom presentation about it, is called Suffragette. And it's about that was what the men called them as they were sort of marching and protesting really for the right to vote. And
yeah, absolutely. And I think that the suffragette comes into households really early because they use it in the original Mary Poppins.
It's true.
So that's, you know, I have a 6-year-old. So a couple years ago when I was doing this, he was very into that because Mary Poppins.
I love that part in her sash. And
she has the sash. She's right.
Yeah. All right. So were kids ever involved in the voting process or the campaign process at any time, you know, in American history?
Yeah. It's two things. I think of two things within the suffrage movement that involved kids. One was that sometimes in parades, just like in the Women's March, women brought their daughters and sometimes sons with them to participate in this civic movement. One of my favorite pictures it's a New York City suffrage march, and they're all the women are in white, and a woman is pushing just a very rudimentary stroller. That was my first thought, was how did she push that 5 miles down Fifth Avenue? But it's probably about a 1-year-old in the stroller. And then also politically, part of the big movement for women to have the vote was that in states where women could already vote, because it did some states, just like we have now, state laws were crazy, and some, or not crazy, but very different. And some states gave women the right to vote first. And a lot of those states that gave women the right to vote had better child labor laws. And so one sort of argument the women used was protect our children better, give women the right to vote. And then a sort of just fun one was at the beginning of World War I, when the suffrage movement was really building. And at the same time, they were suggesting people buy cotton to support Southern farmers during war times, essentially. And the head of the suffrage movement came up with the idea to have a campaign to suggest everyone buy a bale, as a patriotic move, and then created a pattern of a suffrage doll, so a little girl in a yellow dress with a suffrage sash, and suggested you could make that doll with a bale of hay. So it was sort of an innovative way to be patriotic and get her suffrage ideas in the hands of a lot of little girls. And the reason I know that story was because the Library of Congress has a big suffrage exhibit right now, and when I talked to the head of that exhibit, she said that pattern was sort of her favorite find of all of the archives that the Library of Congress went through to do that thing.
Can you see that online, that exhibit?
Yeah, you can. Yes, it is still. If maybe the Library of Congress is open now. I don't know, actually, I should check, but the exhibit's still on, and you can flip through all of their items, and it's really, it's wonderful. It's Susan B. Anthony's diary and planners of at the very final vote where they were lobbying different states, so handwritten planners, and obviously a ton of photographs and even video of those early suffrage parades. Yeah, it's really fun.
So here's a question. So you have to be 18 to vote. And how was that age picked? Was it always that age?
No, it was 21 for a very, very long time. 21 was, I don't know if 21 was always the age in Britain, but that's where it came from here. And it was 21 until an amendment was passed, added to the Constitution in 1972. So 18 is a pretty new thing. Eisenhower was the first to sort of push for that, with the idea of if you can go to war, you can vote. But that didn't pick up a ton of steam until the Vietnam era, when many, 18, 19, 20-year-olds thought maybe that war wouldn't even been happening if that age group had the right to vote. And it was sort of a surprise. Ted Kennedy and a Republican senator snuck it into the Voting Rights Act. Re-up. They have to re-up the Voting Rights Act, and it was a time, and they put it in at the last minute, and it passed, and it actually caused a huge scramble. There was a Supreme Court argument saying you can change the federal age but not the state age, and there wasn't time to change all the state ages, and so it was an amendment that had to happen really quickly. It happened over months, and it was the fastest ever amendment process was for 18-year-olds. But yeah, it's a new in the scheme of voting rights. It's 18-year-olds are very new to the game.
I was born in 1972, so it's a very young.
There you go.
Yes.
Yeah, very, very young. Absolutely.
All right. So you wrote in both versions of the book about voting heroes, and share with us who some of those voting heroes are. They're really sweet little mini profiles.
Yeah, and there's obviously a ton of historical voting heroes, the suffragists, and then people who were African Americans who were very active in fighting for being able to keep the Black vote, and then fighting for it back in the states where they lost it. But for current kids today, I really tried to highlight current voting heroes. So one is Dale Ho, who runs the voting rights arm of the ACLU, and he told me he really came to this work because he was so inspired by reading about the civil rights movement when he was in high school and college, but just felt like he wasn't a marcher or a, give a big rallying speech guy, and felt he could write and research. So he became a lawyer and wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. But it turned out he was really good at it. So despite his wanting to sit in his office and read, he sometimes has to argue Supreme Court cases, and in fact argued the census case. That was one of the biggest cases last term, and won that. So he's a guy who ended up not where he thought he would be as far as out of his office, but following voting rights. And then another that I loved that was really fun is there's a man named Dave Wasserman, who is a reporter who covers Congress, but by covers Congress, it means that he knows all 435 congressional districts, their shapes, their populations, what cities they have and don't have. He just like is an encyclopedia of that. And in talking to him, I learned of a story of he ran not too long ago into an elementary school teacher of his who had kept a map he drew of his neighborhood when he was in her class, because he was just obsessed with maps, and she really encouraged him, and he was obsessed as a kid and as obsessed as an adult. So it really,
wow.
It's kind of like if you have something that you really love and it might one day help the world, keep at it. There's so many ways to contribute to voting and democracy, and I like those stories.
The teachers you have right now are going to say, when I was a teacher, right,
exactly.
I had that wonderful child in my class.
Yeah.
What he or she has done now. So
yeah, that kid wanted to make sure everyone's parents are registered to vote. That's what they could be saying tomorrow.
Yeah. All right. So, and tell us, should you tell about Shaniqua?
Oh, I do love that one. So there's a young woman.
What she does now, though, too.
Sure. She's not even 30, and she works. There's one of the most popular political podcasts is called Pod Save America, and she works for that organization as their political director, which means she does outreach to get out the vote, and staff when people used to canvass, go door to door to canvass, and now texting, and she's just in charge of mobilizing people to actually vote. And she told me that her whole public service career started also, the idea of it, when she was in elementary school, and she had to go to the restroom one day and raised her hand and said, "Can I go to the bathroom?" And the teacher basically was trying to get her to say, "May I go to the bathroom?" but instead just said, "I don't know, can you?" And she was flustered and embarrassed, and she was little. I think she was in first grade, and she was too scared to say anything and wet her pants. And so it was terrible. But she remembers a friend holding her hand, and then her mom coming to tell the teacher, "Please don't ever do that again." And it just really stuck with her, as she felt like she had no voice, and she wanted to spend a life helping those that didn't have a voice. And so it really was this tiny moment in her life that has led her to do these things where she's now running voter mobilization for literally hundreds of thousands of people. So
wow,
it's pretty cool.
That teacher sounds like a real jerk too, by the way. But
yeah, although you know what, sometimes it takes jerks in your life to put you on a path of greatness.
That's true. That's a very excellent point. All right, so can you explain for the adults and the kids, because I think there's a lot of terms that we use that just we sort of throw around, and I don't always necessarily really know what they mean. And one of the things I'd love you to explain a bit for us is polling. I mean, what exactly is polling? What is it? Where do they get those numbers? And then how important are they? And I don't know, tell us a bit about that.
So I have a whole chapter on polling, and it isn't because I think we should live and die by it or spend a lot of time worrying about it, but it's because it's just, polls are this circular thing that tell the campaigns use them to see what people are thinking of, but also where to put their money and where to run ads and what people are thinking about. And then those ads influence what people are thinking about. And it's just this, the world might be better if we didn't have them, but they're not going away, especially in our increasingly like data driven world. How they do them, just the ones that are still considered most accurate are phone, when they actually call people on the phone. That's now a big problem because we all have caller ID, and even now it comes up with like political call. So they're getting more sophisticated about doing them online. But one thing that I want to stress about polls is if it's a poll that you can opt into, so you see it on Facebook and you can just decide yourself whether you want to participate, that poll is not accurate. It's not weighted for anything. Ignore those. But the polls that we're talking about that are reliable are the ones that news organizations do, or places like Gallup or Pew, kind of names that you would recognize.
Mm-hmm.
And for these political polls, especially president, when you're looking at them, you need to ask what it is they're telling you. And the two main things are they telling you the percentage of vote that the person is likely to get, which, you know, might be 55 to 45, you know, one candidate versus the other, even closer, versus what got everyone into trouble in their minds in 2016 was what percentage chance does the candidate have for winning. So if you look back to 2016, a lot of polls had Hillary with a 70% chance of winning, even an 80% chance of winning. And what a lot of people forgot is that an 80% of winning means a 20% chance of losing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's no joke, you know. But so if people had focused more on how close the national race was, you know, 80% sounds much different than you're winning 49% to 47%.
Right.
So that's the first, is think about what it's telling you. The other thing is sort of look at what the margin of error means, which is by how much they're likely to have messed up the polls.
Mm-hmm.
And if those numbers aren't more than twice apart what the margin of error is, you know, that they're too close to tell anyway. So it's really focusing on what that percentage is, but also one of the a woman who really spends her life looking at these polls. She works at one of these, you know, sort of right-leaning think tanks, but this is what she does. And it drives her nuts that people focus so much on what she calls these horse race polls of, you know, who's ahead this minute. And instead she likes to look at this poll that Gallup does, where they've asked since, I think it's 1932. I mean, for every week since 1932.
Since 1932, they ask the same question.
Same question every week, which is basically, what are you most concerned about to Americans? And if you look at it historically, just after the Depression era, when they first started doing it, people were concerned about the economy. If you looked at it in 1965, when Lyndon B. Johnson was working on passing the Voting Rights Act, civil rights and voting rights are front and center. When you look at right when Obama was elected, the economy. So looking at those sort of polls kind of tell you what people are really thinking about.
The issues matter more.
Yeah, it gives you a little bit, if you want to get that deep into it, the issues kind of tell you a little more than those polls. And then the other thing that's probably the absolute most important is that polls are a snapshot in time. They're today, they are useless tomorrow. And the cliche that is very true is the only poll that matters on election day is election day. So no matter what the polls are saying, never let a poll keep you from voting. I mean, that's just an enormous error.
So don't trust any poll that would have you as a respondent. And
well, if someone from a reputable organization reaches out to you, that means they've chosen you because you fit in their giant mix. Yeah, I mean, you can't, if you're doing a poll on the presidency, you can't either just talk to 200 people in San Francisco or 200 people in rural Oklahoma. You know, there's a whole lot of science that goes into it. And then of course for the president, what really matters is the swing state polls. So the national polls are sort of interesting to look at, but what's happening in Michigan is way more important than what's happening in the national polls as far as the president.
So speaking of that, explain, if you can, the Electoral College.
Sure. So the sort of easiest way to describe what the Electoral College does is that we do elect presidents by popular vote, except it's the popular vote by 50 states and DC. So it's just 50 individual popular vote races. Then you throw them all together. So total, there are 538 electoral college votes, and they're split between all the states in DC. Everybody gets at least 3. So even the smallest states have 3 because they have 1 member of the House of Representatives and they have 2 senators.
So it corresponds to the representation in the Congress.
Right. And then California, because they have the biggest population, they have the most electoral college votes, and they're at 55, I believe. So the 2 senators plus their number of representatives. And in all states but 2, the winner of the popular vote, whether it's by 2,000 votes or 2 million votes, the winner of the popular vote in that state gets all the electoral college votes.
Okay.
So that's why what gives you a blue state is that California and New York are certain to vote for the Democrats when the popular vote. And so all those electoral college votes will go to the blue states. And then, you have your red states. Texas is usually a reliable red state. Mm-hmm. So you need 270 electoral college votes to win. So they call them swing states because you know which states are red, you know which states are blue, and add up that math. And then you need, Florida, who knows which way it's going to go. And so the play really is for the electoral college votes of those few states that the outcome isn't certain.
And so if I recall correctly from, whenever I learned all this, that this system was designed to make sure that states that didn't have massive populations still had some say in the outcome. And is it necessary still? I mean, I know it would be, a big process to get rid of the Electoral College, but there's certainly been conversation about it. I'm curious, given all the research you've done, how contemporary of a tool is the Electoral College? Is it still important?
Whether it's important is truly who you ask. It is up for debate. It's not a yes or no answer for sure. One of the main reasons it was first created was because there wasn't the internet, but there weren't even really national newspapers. Like, it was hard to count all the votes and bring them to one place. It was a physical problem. Okay. Clearly that's not something we have right now. And many scholars argue that it was created to kind of protect the slave states who didn't count enslaved people as full people, and so their voting population was much lower. No matter how you kind of look at it or which version of why we have it you believe, those reasons don't really last to today. Mm-hmm. But we still have it, and it benefits the smaller states. It benefits swing states no matter which way they end up going, because it gives them all this power. It makes presidential candidates who maybe wouldn't stop by so much be there all the time. So to change it now would require some of those states, and then states that are so-called purple states, either giving up their power, or those, like in Texas, where the Republican Party is still in charge, but not in charge by a ton, they would be giving up a lot of power if they tried to switch
also the all or nothingness of it.
Right. Yeah. There is nothing that keeps states from deciding not to do it all or nothing. I mean, that's where the real change can be. States decide how they split up their votes. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing to say that, New York couldn't pass a law before the next presidential election that says our electoral college votes go to the popular vote winner, or we're going to split them up. Whoever wins 60% of the vote gets 60% of the electoral college votes. So I think it's going to be that, like the state movements, or there's a movement for states to sort of bind together and agree to give their votes to the popular vote winner. And that's something that has like 19 states who have agreed to do it. but it doesn't kick in until enough states that are in the pact have 270 votes.
Okay.
So it's the math is annoying and complicated, but it's probably going to be something like that rather than a constitutional amendment that changes that.
All right, so let's talk about the book a little bit specifically.
Sure.
It's really a wonderful story how you came to write this book. Will you share it? Share the story.
So after 2016, I was writing a lot of feature stories about, Katie, everything. Any feature stories for a variety of things, entrepreneurs or podcasts or whatever it was. But I just kept thinking I wanted to get involved in what felt like the biggest story that there was right then. As reporters, we're nosy people, and I wanted to get in that game a little more. And as I was trying to figure out my role, I saw on Instagram, as where we find so much good things these days, Reese Witherspoon was interviewing the author Ann Patchett, who wrote Bel Canto and Commonwealth and some of my other favorite books. And Anne said that she was writing a book about women and voting. And, I just thought, I'm a good researcher and I can conduct interviews. Maybe she needs some help. So I sent her an email through her publicist saying, if you need help, I would like to do it. And in a great surprise to me, she got back to me and said, what can you do for me? So I was like, great. So we really did hit it off and had the kind of same idea of writing a book that was really accessible and just kind of gave people in an interesting, digestible way the information they needed to go. We were both certain that it should be a pretty short book, and it did end up being that. So I was researching for her and everything was going great. She was working on a novel, and in the end she wanted more time on her novel and said, this is your book, you've done all the work, go forth. And so in about a span of 2 weeks, I went from this as a sort of side project that I'd let take over my life to, okay, let's write a book in the next 8 months. So
2 books.
Here I am. 2 books. Yeah. At first it was only 1 book. That was the trick. It became 2 books. Gosh, about 6 months later, the children's book was a real and a fast endeavor, but it was exciting to get it done. But yeah, so not only
a wonderful story of somebody, so famous and beloved, really supporting the career of another woman. It's such a really beautiful. She's just a wonderful person. And as I've come to know her, I am not, my story is unique within even Anne's world. But she's very much about building people up. And it was just, she trusted her idea and my carrying it forward. And yeah, it was really lovely. And she was supportive the whole way. She read the first, as you know, first drafts can need some work. And this one did, like all others. And she even, she read that for me and gave me extensive notes. She really, she was like, I got you into this. I better help you out. So, at times I was like, yes, you did. But very helpful. So now you have found yourself sort of talking about voting at what has to be the most sort of disruptive moment in voting, since women got the right to vote, who knows,
contentious wise, since the passage of the Voting Rights Act and what led to it, I would think. Certainly voter suppression has continued. So it's not as if on any level have we not needed to continue to grow and work and people continue to fight for voter access. But what is so unique about right now is that it's affecting everybody. Mm-hmm. And it's both access to the polls and it's just the sheer volume of changes and how are we going to get this done. So it's voter rights issues, and then it's just the mechanics of it. And things are moving really, really quickly at a time when, especially at the beginning of the coronavirus, when they were trying to run primaries, when offices were completely closed. Luckily, you know, all things are moving a little better now, certainly better than we were in March and April.
Right.
So, but yeah, it's sort of, it's an unbelievable time, but our voting history really is up and down and checkered and took a whole lot of fight over and over again. So I do feel like in some ways it's another chapter, and in other ways it's changes are fast and furious, and it's also the constant voter fraud discussion is just simply really unusual, and that has added a whole lot of issues to trying to just get the task done.
What are so let's talk about vote by mail, which, you know,
Sure.
has become sort of the new, you know, sort of term of the election. And
Yeah.
is vote by mail different from absentee ballots?
It's really not. And I'll tell you how to describe how non-controversial this could have been. It was always going to be difficult to get the mechanics in place. But at the very start of the coronavirus, I was closing this book. And so we were lucky enough to, I mean, I had truly everything was closed, the book wise. And I was like, hold on, guys, I think we're going to have to add some paragraphs. Because I had covered vote by mail, but not extensively, partially because it's kind of not that exciting or sexy. Yeah. You vote by mail. But it's nearly all states every state has some version of vote by mail for absentee voting if you're really not going to be there, or you know, you're someone who's confined to their home in the pre-COVID world. So every state has some version of it. They've done it since the Civil War for soldiers. I mean, it is not a new thing. And at the very beginning of the coronavirus, I kind of thought, okay, states are going to have to get up to speed. We have 5 states that already vote nearly entirely by mail. Utah does. Oregon has done it for a really long time. Colorado has for the last decade really built up their system, and they figured out how to do it correctly and safely. And so I was like, all right, all these Secretary of States can get in their room, the state Secretary of States obviously can get in a room and figure out best practices and make this work. And of course, instead, it just kind of became this enormous touchstone. So what's happened instead is that states have kind of figured it out state by state, what they're willing to allow and who can do it. But as it stands today, only about 6 states, I think, and truly it could have changed while we were on this Zoom. Only 6 states aren't allowing vote by mail for nearly anyone who wants to this round. So it has expanded hugely. But I think I mentioned to you earlier was that in 2016, all but 34 states allowed anyone to vote absentee, which is by mail, with no excuse. So we could have had these huge numbers in 2016 or before then. It just wasn't something that people thought about doing as much. But we are going to have a massive increase in the numbers. A little below 25% of Americans voted by mail in 2016, which I think that's a number that kind of surprises people. That's a lot of people. So it kind of shows how sort of normal it was, and that it was being used on a pretty decent scale. We're almost at a quarter. Numbers also keep changing, but around 60% or a little higher of people have said they're either likely or definitely going to vote by mail. So that's just a very, it's just a lot of people who haven't done it before, a lot more ballots in the mail, and a lot more ballots to be counted. I really try to think of, because all that sounds really overwhelming. And so I try to think, what does the voter need to think about? And voters need to decide if they need to vote by mail, If they don't and can go vote early in person, that might be the best choice this election. It just is one less ballot that has to go through the vote by mail system and go through the postal office. If you do want to vote by mail, you just really have to make sure you request your ballot immediately if you live in a state where you need to. And then when it comes, follow all the directions to a T. Make sure, look at them 3 times, you know, because anytime anybody's doing something the first time, they're more likely to mess up. And in our primary elections, we had a much higher than usual number of ballots that were thrown out that weren't counted because they either had a signature that didn't match the one on the voter roll, which means people were, it just didn't look the same. It's not a fraud thing. It's more likely, you know, you wrote just R for an Rosman on the voter roll and you wrote it out perfectly this round or whatever. Or people forget to sign the outer envelope that shows it's you who's voting. They just forget to sign it. And the other big issue is arriving late. So if you are voting by mail, really check all those things. And then instead of using the Postal Service for the way back, consider finding out where you can drop your ballot off. And your local polling place can tell you that. And it probably is at your Board of Elections, or some places have drop boxes. So find out where you can physically hand it over. And I think that's sort of the best way to do that. And then once you do that, you can, New York just started this round. You can track your ballot online to see when it's received and if they have a problem with it. And if there is a problem with it, they're supposed to let you know this time and let you fix it. But that's brand new for New York this round.
There's a lot of human and other kind of error that can interfere.
It's a lot. Yeah. So it's not fraud, it's and there can be plenty of problems. They should, you know, if they judge the signature too harshly, if the post office might forget to actually stamp the date on it. That did happen a ton in the primary election where they didn't put the June 23rd stamp on it. So even though it arrived June 24th and therefore would have probably had to been mailed the 23rd or before, they had litigation over that. So it's just like, do it as early as possible, hand it in yourself if you can, and then follow up to make sure it's counted. And if all that sounds too stressful, go vote early, which looks like it does on election day.
So before we open it up to questions, I wanted to, when we spoke earlier today, we were sort of brainstorming all the reasons why it's good for America to have a high voter turnout. So
sure.
You know, if you sort of favor one party, you may think that a big voter turnout is going to be good for that part. We're not talking about that. We're talking about why is it just a good idea? And one of the points I'll share that you and I talked about in a conversation before that I was thinking about that we didn't talk about today was that districts that have a low voter turnout, the either state or national party can look at that and decide that it's a easier place to, you know, either sneak in a new candidate, or that it's not good to give money to a candidate who's running there because they're not going to bring people out to the polls. So really have an impact on the support that candidates get it to represent you. And you want a lot of options because you want there to be vigorous debate. So I thought that was very interesting, but tell us another.
So there, I think of this also in 2 ways, which is the second one I'll get to, so don't let me forget, is why do I vote? You know, why should I vote November if I live in an all blue state? And either I'm a blue voter or a red voter, and that applies to us in New York. We know how the presidential election is going to go. But to back up on the broader issue, I really wrote this book and became, when I was doing the research for Anne initially, just sort of obsessed with voter turnout, because I'm a democracy true believer, and that I think every person who has the right to vote in this country should vote, and we should make it convenient for them to do so. I think that's just, to me, that's just like an American ideal. And the reason is because if we only have 60% of eligible Americans voting for the president, or in the midterms, it can be lower, way lower, 50% or below. We aren't electing people. That just doesn't tell us what everyone needs or wants in this country. It's just we don't have a truly representative democracy when we're leaving this many votes on the table. And especially for young people who, in a world where they have so much of what is happening right now is going to affect them specifically and for a long time, whether it's the economy or climate concerns, or for young people, March for Our Lives was such a big deal in 2018, gun safety in schools. But young people really care about those issues, but we're not teaching them how to vote. And so I just think that's really important. We should want a representative democracy. And if then people don't agree with what's happening, then we can figure out how that shakes out. But we're not representing the entire country and what it needs when so few people are showing up. And I just think,
and young people, even 18 to 35, probably aren't voting in huge numbers. And
no, they're the lowest turnout, usually several percentage points under 50% for voters 18 to 29. And so if you have an 18 to 29-year-old in your life, make sure that they're registered, because many of them aren't showing up. So we all think all the young people in our lives are voting. Well, that just can't be true considering the turnout rate. And then the other reason that sort of plays into this, why do I vote if I live in a red state or a blue state? Number one, that only applies to the president, and you need to vote all the way down the ballot, because your mayor, your governor, we're all learning how much those offices and city council and police chief and district attorney, those affect our lives on a daily basis. So it's important to not think of it as a presidential election, number one. But also, even if you're voting for the minority party, showing where your values are and where other people with those same values showing up and voting, every one of those votes tells politicians that many people care. And if our voter turnout rates really stay low, we're going to have politicians who continue to only cater to that small amount of people who vote for them. And that just keeps things on the fringes. And most Americans don't live anywhere near those fringes. So we just need to really, think about who the politicians represent. And if we want them to represent more people, we need to help more people show up.
Yeah. And as you said before, politicians care about people who vote. That's
absolutely. Yeah.
That's who they speak to.
They were, yeah. I was one of my sort of biggest aha moments of reporting this was I was talking to a professor at Reed College in Oregon who's a voting expert, and he was saying that he tells his young college students every year, why my Social Security is taken care of and my mortgage is fine and your student loans are a huge hassle? Because I vote and you don't. So until you start showing up, this is the way it's going to be. And that it's unfortunate that's the way it's going to be, but it's the world that we live in. So we need to help. And then those of us who have the privilege of it being pretty easy for us to vote and we were taught to vote really need to see it as our jobs to help those who just didn't have it as easy and weren't taught these mechanics. As we're all learning, it's not as easy as it sounds. I think that's a big plus from this, is that we're all learning that sometimes you have to put a little thought into it, and helping others, particularly young people, do that is worthwhile.
Well, Erin had suggested in a previous talk of hers that I went to as a listener that every person should reach out to 5 people and just say, what's your voting plan? Do you need any help? And it led me to reach out to my elderly father and stepmother who live in Florida, and they for sure can't go out to the polls because my dad is very susceptible to, but everyone's susceptible to COVID, but he can't be out and about right now. And I helped them find online how to request their vote by mail. And they felt great about it. They were so relieved. And I felt really good about it. It was really, it really made me feel like I did something important for my dad and let him do something important for himself and the country. So I love that.
It's a good thing. It's like it is one of these universally good things. There's nothing bad you're not going to feel bad about helping someone to vote.
Yeah, and you're not telling them who to vote for, you're just trying to help them. All right, so let's go to, there's one question in the Q&A. If you'd like to add some questions, please do so. Okay, is it true if a state's results are not clear and perhaps contested, the respective state's legislature can directly appoint presidential electors? Has this happened? The person goes on to say, I believe in the 2016 presidential election, Colin Powell unexpectedly received 3 electoral college votes.
Right. Okay. So these are, the electoral college is so complicated. Let me say what happened in 2016, because that's more present. Okay. So electors do show up. It's like this very old school thing. It was December 19th in 2016. I think it's like December 8th this year, but it's like the second Wednesday of the first. It's whole language that's slipping my mind, but they have a specific day and they all go to their state capitals. Usually it's the state capital, one from each district, and they say who they're going to vote for. Okay. They're chosen because they follow the party lines. This isn't something that's supposed to keep people on the edge of their seats. Right. But some states don't bind by law. It's just a pledge who you're going to vote for, which does mean in 2016, a few people, like in Texas, there were 3 total that voted for John Kasich, the former Ohio governor. They were supposed to vote for Trump, voted for Kasich. That happens with some regularity, but it's never come even close to impacting the outcome. And it's because the people are chosen specifically because they want, their party's person to win. Okay. A very high percentage of the time. There was a Supreme Court case just recently that said states can bind their electors. So if it's someone
legal for states to say,
right. I mean, it's a pretty the fine is minor and all of those things. But even there were plenty of states that didn't have that law before the Supreme Court election and still don't have one. Mm-hmm. And people just generally kind of do what they're expected. If there is a tie in the Electoral College, there are scenarios where it goes to the Senate to choose, or to the House. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to I need to fill you guys all in. It's all swimming in my brain. I apologize.
That's all right.
We should know what's happening. The people talk about Electoral College tie every single time, and it happened in the 1800s. I mean, they did used to have some crazy electoral battles in the 1800s, which had major outcomes on, it ended Reconstruction once. I mean, it was a mess. But the Electoral College ties, there were some people who were certain it was going to happen with Obama, Romney, and it ended up not even being close. But there are scenarios where it goes to the House, but I sincerely hope that is not where we're going to get you back this round. I know. Yeah, I know. I can't, I apologize.
No.
That's slipping my mind.
Okay. What do you consider to be the biggest obstacle to voter equality in the upcoming election?
It is our main overarching problem is that states can make their own voting laws. And that wouldn't be so bad if they weren't so different all over the place. So even, you know, when you can register in some states, it has to be just before you turn 18. Some you can pre-register at 16. An increasing number of states, you're automatically registered when you interact with the state office, like get a driver's license. So that kind of takes the registration battle out. Some states you can register to vote on election day. So like in Colorado, you can go and register on election day. In Texas, their deadline is coming up in the next week. It's a 30 days before. Ours here in New York is a couple weeks before, October 24th, I believe it is. So I think we'll never, until all states get on the same page and some states don't actively try to make it more difficult, there's not going to be a lot of equality. And then the second huge answer is the parts of the Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court struck down in 2013. Reinstating that would go a long way to ending a ton of the voting rights litigation that goes on. So there have been big changes in voting rights since 2013, and getting that back in what many people are hoping will be called the John Lewis restoration of that is the other big ticket.
Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but we're going to quickly race through two more questions before we wrap up. How long will it take for the votes to be counted, and what will happen if the votes aren't counted by the end of the calendar year?
If I knew exactly how long, it would be the most exciting thing. I wish I did. I would be all over the place. No one really knows, except that it's going to take longer than usual. They're just going to have way more mail-in ballots to count, and that process takes longer. So the first thing to understand is it taking longer is actually the process working. Some states, including some swing states, I believe Michigan is one of them, that you can't even verify, start looking at the envelopes to make sure the signatures, you can't do any of that until election day. Some states are going to be counting as they come in. So that's another thing that's kind of a mess. I think in the presidential election, if it somehow really is a huge landslide one way or the other, we might know that. But it's going to take longer. And we also need to remember that it is never CNN or ABC who decides who wins the election. All of the votes are always counted. It always actually takes longer to certify them. And that's why the Electoral College date isn't until December, to give states the time to really verify things. And so we're just going to have to be patient, and no one wants to. I would like that answer at 9 p.m. on election night, but it just isn't likely going to happen. And then I do think if things have truly gone awry, not just cause of it having gone awry, but true problems, it's possible maybe we'll know that pretty quickly, but there's going to be lawyers from both sides watching everything, because of just the way 2020 is going. I do anticipate there will be litigation in some states, and that may make it last longer, but courts obviously do try to move pretty quickly. But I hope within a week that we'll know for sure.
Last question. With all that you know and all the research that you've done, do you have confidence in our nation's ability right now to come to do you have faith that the election will be fair, that it'll be?
I absolutely think the election will be fair. I am not confident that it will be accepted as fair. I think it's possible that we'll have some cries that it's not. But you have to, I think it's actually important to remember that all of these counts happen in pretty small ways. Like they're in Tuxedo. You guys are a part of a fairly small community and district out there, and it's your people who will be counting those ballots. I'm from Liberty, Texas, which is tiny, and it's those people in that county, they're going to be counting those ballots. And so any sort of mass craziness would have to happen in all of these tiny little places. But if there are a ton of ballots that are late or incorrectly marked, that's why everyone's saying move it in, get them in as early as you can. So you just remove that controversy. There might be some issues. The system is set up to handle this, and we have to trust it. I think that's the most important part. No one knows what's going to happen. No one knows how the reaction's going to be. Mm-hmm. But if we all do our part and vote and make sure our vote is in and counted, that makes it easier on those who are counting. So it's a crazy time for sure. But, should the system hold? Yes, it should.
Erin, this has been so wonderful, truly.
Thank you.
I can't thank you enough. And I wish that we could all be in person together so that you could bask in the appreciation and warmth that I know everybody is feeling right now. I just feel this was informative, spirited, civic-minded, just the sort of discourse that this nation really lacks and needs. And we're so grateful to you that you took a night out when you've got your family, probably scratching at the door wanting to come back.
Are you saying you just heard him scratching at the door? That definitely just happened. Thank you for having me. I obviously love talking about it.
I hope everybody will buy Erin's books. It is, the library is a wonderful place to borrow books, but it is really expensive and timely to write a book. And particularly right now, it's important to support efforts of factual presentation of information with your dollars. And I hope that you'll consider buying the book. And the kids' book is just a wonderful, wonderful gift. I really do think when book fairs open again for schools, it's gonna have a wonderful life there. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Erin. We'll look forward to seeing you here IRL as soon as possible.
All right. Thank you for having me.
Has a great night. Thanks a lot.
Good night, everybody. Bye.